The Soviet Union now has, in the combined category of scientists and engineers, a greater number than the United States. And it is producing graduates in these fields at a much faster rate. Recent studies of the educational standards of the Soviet Union show that this gain in quantity can no longer be considered offset by lack of quality. This trend is disturbing. Indeed, according to my scientific advisors, this is for the American people the most critical problem of all. My scientific advisors place this problem above all other immediate tasks of producing missiles, of developing new techniques in the armed services. We need scientists. In the 10 years ahead, they say we need them by thousands more than we're now presently planning to have. The federal government can deal with only part of this difficulty, but it must and will do its part. The task is a cooperative one. Federal, state, and local governments, and our entire citizenry must all do their share.
Happy Friday, everyone. Today we're wrapping up Science, Technology, and Government by Rothbard, and you can see how timeless his writing was because all these topics are still discussed today. Now, today we're going to discuss the last 6 chapters, and they're all very short. The first is Soviet science, and he starts off by saying, quote, "Planned science sounds impressive. Actually, it means prohibited science, where no scientist can follow the leads of his own creative ideas." Now, at this time period, and again, Murray wrote this in 1959, this was 2 years after Sputnik, which was launched, and there were fears of Russian domination. That was a central fear during the Cold War, which, by the way, lasted from the end of World War II till the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But if you recall Professor Baker, who I quoted at the end of yesterday's episode, he found that, quote, "At the beginning of the Soviet Union, the old pre-revolutionary scientists continued to do well, largely because science was not yet under government planning. That came with the second 5-year plan in 1932. And quoting from Baker now. Take almost any branch of non-revolutionary biological science in which outstanding discoveries were made in the outside world during the years of the plan, and you are likely to find that the whole subject was excluded from study. So essentially, whether it was communist Russia or Nazi Germany, there was always an attempt by the state to block out real science. And the Lysenko controversy was the Soviet plan to eradicate the science of genetics, as just one example. And Murray makes a bold claim. It's not simply that the Hitlers or Stalins are naturally perverse men, but that, quote, "Such actions are inherent in the very nature of statism and central planning." The next little section is an interesting read. Government control of science, government planning of science, is bound to result in the politicization of science, the substitution of political goals and political criteria for scientific ones. Even pro-Soviet scientists have admitted that Soviet research is inferior to American, that basic, as contrast to applied research, is neglected, that there is too much red tape, that little fundamental creative work has been done. And he points out that no wonder that in a list drawn up by 7 scientists of the 24 most important scientific discoveries made between World War I and II, not one came from the USSR. The next chapter talks about the inefficiency of military research by government, and he brings up the Hoover Commission Task Force report on research activities, which showed that 3/5 of the military funds spent by government in 1955 were on operations in private laboratories, which, quote, "was a clear admission that governmental laboratories are not good places to conduct basic research." The report found that perhaps 1/2 of the work done in the laboratories of the military can readily be placed in the civilian economy. And the report concluded, "A considerable portion of the work now done in installations of the government should be done in the civilian economy." But even relating to the question of what is government poor on all, why is government poor in all research and development, but relatively effective in such work as testing and establishment? The task force pointed out that The operations of research and development are highly creative and imaginative. They require men with a special type of qualification and a high level of training. Most of the operations of the establishment, placement, and monitoring of programs and the tests for evaluations are much less creative and more engineering in their nature. Now, again, these last few chapters are short, so we're already on chapter 7 now, which is atomic energy. Now, the main fallacy libertarianism takes down again and again is the fallacious idea that without the government, things don't get done. It's just simply not true, and it's quite the opposite in relation to things like atomic energy. Yet again, referencing back to the paper, The Sources of Innovation, it pointed out that the fundamental atomic discoveries were made by academic scientists working with simple equipment. And this quote captures that idea precisely. We could not afford elaborate equipment, so we had to think. Now, Murray notes a study that showed virtually all the early work on atomic energy up to the end of 1940 was financed by private foundations and universities. Here's a super interesting point. The same study showed that governmental control of research slowed down rather than speeded up peacetime atomic development. They warned that latest estimates hold that even by the year 2000, less than 1/2 of the total output of electricity will come from atomic energy. And how about that? That was written, in the 1950s. Today, nuclear energy actually represents less than 10% of electricity. So 50%, get out of town. We're not even close. Now, war doesn't speed up technological development, contrary to what some might say. And John Neff, who is an economic historian, noted that little technological progress is possible during a war, except of the hothouse variety, which is forced and superficial, and that whatever gains have been made in military technology have come as a consequence of more general scientific and industrial advances. The next quote by Murray, I think about, sums up the whole book. How shall we finance our future explorations in space? The answer is simple. Insofar as space explorations are a byproduct of needed military work, and only insofar, let the space exploration proceed on the same basis as any other military research. But to the extent that it is not needed by the military and is simply a romantic penchant for space exploration, then this penchant must take its chances like everything on the free market. It may seem exciting to engage in space exploration, but it is also enormously expensive and wasteful of resources that could go into needed products to advance life on Earth. And that's Murray writing at his best, by the way. But even still, the Hoover Task Force the Hoover Task Force found that atomic energy commissions, nuclear plants were all operated by contract installations by private industry or by universities. In 1954, for example, the Atomic Energy Commissions awarded nearly 18,000 prime contracts to over 5,000 firms, who in turn let more than 375,000 subcontracts. As a result, all the major productive facilities of the atomic energy program have been designed, built, equipped, and operated by private firms. The Atomic Energy Act of 1954 relaxed the monopoly, and right away you had, for example, Consolidated Edison, who announced plans for building a 200,000 kilowatt atomic power generating plant at Indian Point, New York, with no help whatsoever from government except permitting the company to buy atomic fuel. Amazing things happen when the government gets out of the way. And the chapter ends with a quote by the Task Force report from February 1955, and it reads, "The risks of ownership are inseparably woven into the concept of private property. When an owner is relieved of his normal risks, other than by his own effort and industry, he is beholden to those who assume the risks in his place. This increases the likelihood that he also will be relieved of the other attributes of property ownership, the right, for example, to decide how, when, where, and by whom the property shall be used. In the end, he is likely to be relived of the property as well." Now, chapter 8 is the next chapter. It's about a paragraph long, so I'm pretty much going to quote the whole chapter. It's about basic research. The National Science Foundation, in its 1957 study of American research and development, concluded that our overall effort is ample. It also concluded, however, that we are deficient in basic research and that this phase of R&D needs encouragement. It recommends a program of federal encouragement ranging from tax exemptions to federal aid. We have seen, however, that the great bulk of basic research takes place in private university laboratories, and that the Hoover Task Force has found the government incompetent to perform even military R&D, much less civilian. Chapter 9 discusses what should the government do to encourage scientific research. He gives 7 planks. Shift military research R&D from government to private contracts, pay market wages for scientists, relax civil service red tape, remove undue security regulations, remove Atomic Energy Commission regulations and subsidies, encourage state government to shift from regressive to truly progressive education, and number 7, encourage state governments to repeal regulation of the public industry. He then goes on to list another 12 points, and I won't read them all, but they speak of tax credits to business corporations for contributions to science, all sorts of tax deductibles, etc. What the government can do, to put it simply, is cease to interfere. Just cease to interfere. Chapter 10 is my favorite chapter in the book because it deals with automation. The fears of automation, or more accurately, the idea of technological unemployment, as Murray notes, have been prominent since even the early days of the Industrial Revolution, when benighted workers smashed machines which came to create jobs for them and raise their standards of living. Then he goes on to say, it is about time that this absurd notion of technological unemployment be laid to rest once and for all. Who was displaced by the steam shovel? How many millions of ditch diggers are now out of work because of it? Where are the billions of unemployed that are supposed to have been caused by the replacement of the human pack animal by wagon and the truck? Where are they if the doctrine of technological unemployment is correct? Where are the millions of unemployed resulting from the Industrial Revolution, when the truth is the other way around, that thousands of beggars had nothing to do until the Industrial Revolution rescued them? Again, Murray is very powerful there with his writing. He gives a quick economic lesson that nearly half of products have an elastic demand, meaning changes in prices will cause immediate changes in consumption, versus if goods are inelastic, a sudden price spike wouldn't necessarily translate into a loss of demand, at least not right away. But if the product is elastic, as he notes, then the lower prices and lower costs will stimulate increased demand and increased production. If the demand is inelastic, then the improvements will cause less resources to be devoted to the industry and lower employment. But since prices have declined, the consumers take the funds that they had formerly spent on the industry and spend them elsewhere, thus generating more employment in other industries. Very simple yet crucial economic point to understand. He talks about the Earl of Halsbury, writes that he knows of no instance where technological progress has caused prolonged unemployment, or indeed where technological regression has caused unemployment. Another argument is that as automation increases, demand for skilled workers increases, but demand for unskilled workers decreases. This isn't necessarily the case, as Earl of Halsbury points out, that there is a 2% natural turnover in industry per annum due to retirement of old and recruiting of young workers, and that the redeployment of labor caused by automation will not be nearly as heavy at this rate. Michael Argyle pointed out that in his piece, Social Aspects of Automation, that about 10% of workers leave per annum for other reasons, and that these too will buffer against forced unemployment. Another point made, just because automation increases doesn't mean everything goes away. Automation is only useful in certain industries. Take, for example, homemade goods like crafts, or how about just actual services provided by people, etc. These can't be factory produced. Frank Woolard wrote in his book Automation and Engineering Production that if by the term automatic factory, one is tempted to think of a plant in which the materials are loaded at the beginning of the week, then everyone goes home to play golf expecting to come in on Saturday morning to find the work loading itself on trucks for dispatch. The automatic factory is just a pipe dream. I doubt very much whether we should ever see anything of the sort. H.R. Nicholas, who was a prominent British trade union leader, showed in Administrative Applications of Automation that automation creates employment, and that our present-day technology has been a boon rather than a handicap to employment. He ends the chapter by saying, let us therefore put aside the old Luddite boogeyman of technological unemployment and hail modern developments of automation for what it is and will be, a superb method of greatly increasing the standards of living. All right, well, we've covered 10 chapters, and the last chapter is an epilogue on the value of technology. Again, referring to those who view technology as the boogeyman that depersonalizes him and ruins his culture, Murray says that, fortunately, this view is overwhelmingly rejected by the bulk of our nation. He quotes Professor Ernest Nagel of the Department of Philosophy at Columbia University. It is by no means evident that a life of deep satisfaction and dedication to the values of a liberal civilization is enjoyed by a smaller fraction of American society than of other types of cultures, whether past or present. Critics of American mass culture tend to forget that only comparatively small elite groups in the great civilizations of the past were privileged to share in the high achievements of those cultures. The evidence seems to me overwhelming that the growth of scientific intelligence has helped to bring about not only improvements in the material circumstances of life, but also an enhancement in its quality. In the last quote by Father Bernard Dempsey of the Institute of Social Order will strike a chord with you. There are those who see in the mechanization of modern industry an inevitable and devastating anti-personnel force. First of all, man has been condemned to earn his bread in the sweat of his brow, and yet past ages have more sweat and less bread than typical American industrial workers experience. Finally, the industrial discipline can also be challenging, interesting, and inspiring, especially when an able mechanic has furnished good tools and materials to work with. We must not forget that the farmer is weather paced, season paced, and animal paced, with a tyranny that is least as exacting as the industrial discipline. In the day of serfs in Western Europe, the horse was the symbol of nobility and knighthood. Many American workers in the course of a day control more horsepower than there was in the whole field of Agincourt. Now, I really hope you enjoyed this 4-part series, and please leave some feedback to let me know how you enjoyed it. We covered 118 pages of pure devastation to the proponents of state-funded scientific research. It should be quite clear by now that not only can government not fund research morally or effectively, but that the state, again, like Murray stated, attempts to boil the individual down to the lowest common denominator, as if we are robots. Well, we'll do it all again next week, but on a different topic. This is Stephen Clyde here. I wish you all well this weekend, and as always, for peace and liberty. Hey everyone, please like, follow, donate, subscribe, and share. Any donations will be used to reach more people.